All right, so we are back with Tim Brooks, and today we are going to be talking about World Endangered Writing Day, a very important day, obviously, to focus on what the Endangered Alphabets Project is all about. So for those who don't know, let's start with just a general intro. What is World Endangered Writing Day? When is it? And how did it come about? What's some of the thinking, some of the idea behind it?
Yes. January the 23rd, I was actually thinking about this in the bath last night, as we English tend to do, and I realized that there's really kind of two levels of meaning to this World Endangered Writing Day. One of them is sort of what you'd expect from an organization called the Endangered Alphabets Project, namely to introduce and explore the notion that there are forms of writing all around the world that are threatened, that only a few people are still using. And that's kind of the focused definition of Endangered Writing Day. And obviously we can get into that more in a minute. But I was also thinking about the fact that the reason why I actually thought of inventing this day was that I was doing research into the Balinese script from Bali, which is this absolutely beautiful script. And I discovered that one day a year, the day that is consecrated to the goddess Saraswati, who is the goddess of wisdom and knowledge and writing, in fact, that the Balinese have this extraordinary tradition where they venerate their books and their writing. And so they have these traditional books which are made of palm leaves, which are trimmed into oblongs and written on by hand. And on Saraswati Day, they take them out and they dust them off, they clean them, and they put them in a position of honor in the house. And I thought, we don't do anything like that. We don't venerate traditional knowledge. We don't venerate books. We don't venerate handwriting. And in fact, January the 23rd is also National Handwriting Day in the US. And so the notion of World Endangered Writing Day takes on this kind of broader meaning where you start saying, is writing itself in some respects endangered? Or are certain ways in which writing has been practiced endangered?
So we're really looking at two related but somewhat distinct things here. On the one hand, we're looking at scripts and the scripts that are endangered from, other hegemonic scripts or something like that. But then we're looking at the act of writing itself, writing by hand itself, right? Because that's an interesting point because, there is no argument that any serious person could make that, for example, the Latin script is endangered, right? That the evidence for that is around us everywhere. But we could certainly make the argument that certain forms of handwritten Latin script are endangered. I mean, there are people in the US who can't read cursive anymore, let alone write it. They can't even read it. So yeah, that certainly is an interesting way to sort of shift our attention to not just looking at the endangered scripts itself, but maybe considering are some forms of written communication, some manifestations of written communication themselves becoming endangered.
So that's a really great way of helping people to understand why these individual unique scripts from around the world are important to their communities or their cultures. So one of the things that we hear regularly on the news in the United States is, my kids couldn't read the Declaration of Independence, for example. And what that really shows is the relationship between writing and history and tradition and identity. Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta in the UK, these are central to understanding who we are, how we got here, what our values are. So similarly, if you have a culture such as the Balinese, for example, who have been writing in their own script for hundreds of years, and they get to the point where they are not using that script because the Indonesian government has decided we're going to use the Latin alphabet, then those people are going to be cut off from everything written in that script for centuries. And to give you a very specific example, I got a wonderful email from a young woman on the island of Java, which is actually right next to Bali. And she said that she had come across some letters that were written by either her father or her grandfather, who had been a soldier in the Indonesian struggle for independence after World War II.
Oh, wow.
And she was fascinated to find these, and she really wanted to know what he did and what it meant to him, and how this kind of crucial period in their post-colonial history, how it went down at the time, etc. But he was writing in the traditional Javanese script, which is actually very similar to the Balinese script, and she couldn't read it. And so her sense of connection with her family and with her community and with the meaning of being Javanese was absolutely derailed by the fact that this script was no longer being used.
That is very interesting. And that makes a lot of sense. Like, I can see how that would be. I mean, even just sort of comparing it to my own personal experience, I had an uncle by marriage who was from Norway. This is a great uncle, actually, or great uncle by marriage who was from Norway. And he had sent the family, lots of postcards and that kind of thing, and would receive postcards from family back in Norway. And we were going through, some of our family documents one time, it's a few years ago. And there were a whole bunch of postcards that he had and had been sent to him from family. And since I can read Swedish, I can kind of make my way through Norwegian. But of course, they're all in cursive. And if I wasn't able to read cursive, that whole part of our family history, the things that my great uncle's brothers were referring to and that kind of thing about, your trip over to the States and then your new daughter and all that kind of thing, that would have all been lost. We would not have had access to a large part, actually, of our family history had I not been able to do that. And this is using, again, an alphabet that's not even slightly endangered, but a form of writing that arguably is endangered, and it would have been completely cut off from us. How much more so if the entire script, not just that particular form of the script, but the entire script is unintelligible to you? Then it's a way of, it almost deracinates people. It severs them from, like you said, that connection with their either their immediate genetic history or their larger cultural societal history.
Yeah, and in fact, sort of along with your notion of deracinating or uprooting, is this other assumption. So let's talk about how this actually plays out in communities around the world. So there is a very strong association that people make between writing and civilization, or writing and being civilized. And in fact, one of the ways in which people think of the birth of what we call civilization is evidence of writing. And all of that sounds fine until you come across people who either don't use writing at all, or use a form of writing that is different to your own, especially if you are a wealthier, more powerful neighbor or a colonizer or whatever. And then what happens, and this happens throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, you get a kind of contempt that people who see themselves as being more civilized or more developed have for their lesser cousins. They refer to them as being primitive or backward or tribal or whatever, because they are either not writing at all or they're using a form of writing that is theirs and theirs only. And when that happens, you get this kind of interesting mental shift where the more powerful neighbor or colonizer or whatever says, oh, we will introduce our form of writing to them, and it will be for their own good.
Good. Yep.
It will be a way of improving them. They can now, use, let's say, the Latin alphabet, which is the European alphabet. It will give them the gateway to the world, all this kind of thing. Not realizing that there is such a profound connection between this culture and the script that they have developed, in the same way they've developed their own music, their own art forms, their own practices of dance, their own forms of clothing. You would never think of saying to them, hey, stop doing that. Those beautiful Guatemalan fabrics, those are primitive. It doesn't work like that. But with writing, it really happens and has happened all over the world for centuries, hence World Endangered Writing Day.
I totally see what you're saying, because you're right. There's an enormous space there for that sort of benevolence bias to creep in and say, oh, we're doing this, like you say, for their own good. We're helping them, right? Because they either don't have a writing system or because it's primitive, quote unquote. And primitive, of course, is really just code for not ours. Right? Exactly. It is not something that springs from what we consider to be the foundation of knowledge. Therefore, it is not legitimate as knowledge.
Yep.
And so we're going to come and help these people, like you say, with that. And I think, there's another factor that's at play there too, because we look at, I like that example you just gave of, for example, the Guatemalan fabrics, because oftentimes what gets preserved, what the hegemonic power will allow to be preserved, or even encourage occasionally the preservation of, are those more portable and approachable, I'll say it like that, aspects of the other culture. In other words, you can take that fabric and make clothing out of it, or decorate your home with it, or something like that. In other words, the hegemonic power might find something about the other community aesthetically pleasing, or maybe they want to.
It's not a threat.
Exactly. It's not a threat. And it might be even something they enjoy, food or something like that, right? But anything that is not immediately accessible to them, that they can that they can turn to their ends, right? Like fabric, music, food can be, is, then decided to be, or declared primitive, not worthy, all these things that are said. And eventually
it actually goes further than that, because as writing is a means of conveying information and sharing information, if somebody is writing or speaking in a language you don't understand, and you've conquered this territory or you're administering this territory, the fear is they're plotting, they're in some sense talking about us. And this gets further added to when the script is used for sacred or religious purposes, because now it's like, oh, and this is part of their pagan religious practices.
Right.
And so, in fact, there have been well-documented instances of one culture actually trying to totally destroy and eradicate the writing of another culture, not just burn some books that have particular subjects, but eradicate everything written in that script. And of course, the best known example is in the 16th century, when the Spanish decide to completely destroy the Mayan script, because not only could it be used in some kind of insurrectionist sense against the Spanish, but it's associated with pagan religion, which they want to stamp out. And so they literally go about trying to burn and destroy everything written in that extraordinarily sophisticated Mayan.
Quite sophisticated. Yeah. And that is, I mean, clearly it's a form of cultural genocide, to do that. Like that is what you are trying to do. You are trying to eradicate the culture. And you can see, even when it's framed the way you just said it, I think that's really instructive, because it sort of puts us in mind, okay, why wouldn't, for example, in the example you just gave, why wouldn't the conquistadors have just, liquidated the whole population, essentially? But when you think about it, that requires that's a risk to your troops. It requires a lot of troops to do that. And then, of course, you don't have the benefit of the labor of enslaved people to do that. So really, you can see how, if you're following that sort of colonizing logic, they are incentivized to practice that kind of cultural genocide. Because you preserve, to some degree, you preserve the people, right, for your own ends, not out of any sense of moral compunction or anything like that. You preserve the people for your own ends, but you attempt to eradicate their culture. And of course, eliminating anything written in that culture script as a way of eliminating their connection to their spiritual traditions is a course of a piece with that.
There's a really clear example of that. And by the way, at the same time the Spanish were burning the Mayan scripts, they were also torturing the Mayan nobles. And when you see the two side by side, you realize that we're not talking about something that is purely linguistic or academic here. It is part of something absolutely savage. So similarly, there used to be, for centuries, this kingdom called Champa, which was roughly where we would now call central Vietnam. And it came under assault by both the Burmese and the Vietnamese. And eventually the Emperor of Vietnam overran Champa, the kingdom, in the mid-19th century. And in addition to imposing a different script on the defeated Cham people, the Cham practiced, some were Hindus and some were Muslims, and the Hindus were forced to eat beef and the Muslims were forced to eat pork. And so it's absolutely part of this whole process of re-indoctrinating the population to the point where they no longer value or even recognize who they are, who they were. And so you essentially become poor cousins at that point. You might literally be, slave labor, but at best, you're poor cousins. And there was a very interesting debate that I saw about the use of or the appearance of a piece of writing in Tibetan script during the recent Olympics. And what was fascinating about this was that some people in Tibet, which of course was invaded by the Chinese, at the end of the 50s and into the 60s, and some people, we're now talking about, the 21st century, were like, oh, look, there's the Tibetan script. This is great. This is a reminder of who we are. Some people were like, yeah, that's just a token thing. It's just a way of trying to keep us happy and to use our Tibetan heritage for tourist purposes and to make to create a kind of a docile and a population and increase tourism. And some people were like, yeah, forget about all of that. That's who we were. We're now, something different to that. Why are you harking back to the old days? And that is such a fascinating and sort of fragmenting argument to have, that you start realizing, you know what? This whole issue of endangered writing is also about the loss of an entire culture, the division of an entire culture, and the loss of identity and pride and a sense of history and tradition, and a sense of where you want to go. Because if you lose sense of where you have come from, it's very hard to have a sense of where you're going.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Because your present station is informed by the past. And of course, your future plans are informed by the present. And if you lose that connection all of a sudden, then it's like, and either you lose it or it is supplanted by somebody else's narrative. Then all of a sudden you do lose that sense. You're right of where you're going to go now as a culture, because you don't even have the ability to look back and see where you've been and what you've done, and see what you want to build on, what you want to modify, maybe even what you want to discard. So culture certainly of their own accord discard things all the time, but they do it of their own accord, based on their own decisions with their own agency. So yeah, absolutely. I don't think people, people who don't work with the kind of things that we work with, I don't think oftentimes people realize, and certainly they can be forgiven for this, because until you get into it, sometimes you don't see it really, and it's not obvious immediately. Yeah. I don't think people realize just how much is at stake in these questions. It's not just a matter of, oh, bummer, we're not going to be able to read these books anymore. Or, oh, it sucks that this font isn't supported, and, you've got to write it in Latin, Arabic, Cyrillic script, Devanagari, what have you. There's so much more behind that. That is just the tip manifestation of a much larger problem, a much larger hegemonic discourse that's happening behind the scenes.
It's interesting you should give those examples, because something else that literally just occurred to me this morning as I was getting ready to have this conversation, I was imagining you asking me, what do you hope to achieve on, World Endangered Writing Day, January 23rd, etc. And I started to think in terms of wanting people to start thinking about writing in a broader and more inclusive sense. And I suddenly realized that certainly in North America, to a certain degree, in the Latin script using world, which obviously includes Western Europe, et cetera, when you think about what other scripts people know about, because there are 300, and most people have no idea that there are that many, and certainly they don't know what they are, et cetera, et cetera. So when you think about what scripts people know about, they tend to be Cyrillic, Arabic, Chinese. And the interesting thing about that is that all three of those cultures and traditions are ones that are often used as enemies in public discourse, and are seen as being, well, we don't want to go in that direction, or we don't want to trust those people, etc. And so our insularity around the Latin alphabet becomes that much stronger. This is ours. It's not these people that we don't know whether we should trust or not. And when you actually, the phrase I use is, you start voyaging out among the endangered alphabets, you start discovering not only all of these other fascinating cultures and fascinating forms of writing, writing that, for example, each letter has its own sacred mystical value, or writing that is so important that people learn it so that when they die, they will be able to progress in the afterlife. I mean, all of these things are absolutely fascinating. So when you start getting out there, it starts dispelling this sense you referred to earlier, which is that what we do must be right. And because it's right, it's okay for us to impose it on everybody else in the world. And so in many ways, the endangered alphabets of the world are endangered because of the spread of the Latin alphabet which has more computers, more guns, more ships than everybody else. I have this saying that the history of the history is written by the winners in the alphabet of the winners. Mm-hmm. And because we are currently the winners, we assume that what you called the narrative, our narrative is correct. It started in ancient Greece. We learned philosophy from them. We are the superior race, which is really kind of interesting when you realize that, Confucius was writing when the ancient Britons were still painting themselves blue with woad, But yes, that's the takeaway that I want people to get, is that willingness to say, you mean there's something else? And, I spent my entire life as a writer and a teacher of writing, and I had no idea there was something else until I, embarked on this work. So to sort of travel out there and start looking at other cultures, other scripts, other ways of thinking about writing itself, that's my goal for World Endangered Writing Day.
Well, and that actually segues perfectly to what I wanted to ask you, because I was going to ask you next, what do you hope to accomplish with this? And you've saved me from asking that and given me a brilliant segue into what I wanted to ask next, which is, so the idea being here to throw open the doors of people's perception a little bit, to help them understand what else is out there in terms of scripts, in terms of ways of looking at writing, in terms of ways, not just how to write, right? Not just how to graphically represent the sounds that we make with our tongue and our jaw muscles and all that, but how to think about what writing can be, what writing is meant to communicate, right? What do you want to do during World Endangered Writing Day to do that? What kind of events, talks, whatever do you want to have to help people learn more about this?
Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about the fact that as the Europeans explored, particularly into Africa, they came across ways of representing knowledge or wisdom that struck them as being primitive because they were based on visual images and symbols. And what we're now starting to realize is that there are certain kinds of information that are way better conveyed by using graphic images. So if you think about European road signs, for example, you need things that people can understand whatever language they speak, exactly, and can understand instantly, as opposed to having to read a bunch of text. And so we're starting to see the gradual overcoming of that prejudice and the merging of these different forms. And when that happens, you start looking around the world and saying, oh, what other ways do people represent meaning? And so one of our speakers is Sabine Hyland, who is one of the world's experts on quipu, which are the Andean and Incan ways of storing and conveying information with knotted fabrics. And these turn out to be way more sophisticated than the kind of abacus that they were originally taken for. And when she talks about the mechanisms, the use of color, the use of spatial relationships involved, you start kind of going, whoa, this is not simply a way of trying to represent how we speak. This symbol equals this sound. This is more like computing. This is more like, how do we store and convey sophisticated, important information in ways that people will understand using materials that people have available, because these fabric materials are readily available in a culture that is going to use them also for clothing and for decoration, all this kind of stuff. So in a sense, it is a brilliant adaptation, in the same way that when the Maori in New Zealand used tattoos, it's another way of using available materials to convey information of importance.
That's absolutely fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. And that makes a lot of sense. And that idea of using available materials, which of course is something that's present in the history of writing everywhere, right? I mean, people, pretty much every script that's been developed, independently developed, started with, how do we make marks on what we've got, right? Whether it be stone or bone or leaves, right? Banana leaves or palm leaves or whatever. But that sense of being in a sort of, not to sound too esoteric about it, but there is a real sense, with no hint of necessarily anything metaphysical, of being in this sort of co-creative dialogue with nature about how that script is going to develop. Because we also know that the very forms, the letter forms or the grapheme forms of a lot of scripts were dictated by the materials on which they were first written.
Exactly. Yeah.
Out of necessity, the physical properties of the medium dictated the grapheme later on, and you see that even today. Even though now you can write on whatever medium you want, including electrons, it's still we see in the letters now that trace of, like I say, of that co-creative dialogue with nature from the past.
Yes, and that's another reason why, if you go into, let's say, Sumatra, and you say, here is the font that everybody else in the world is using, you should use it on your phone as well, then that means the Sumatrans lose their connection with their history of materials and the fact that their grandparents, their ancestors had developed a script exactly using those traditional materials. Going back to what you say about co-creation with nature, so another thing that I ran across, and this turns up a lot in my book, Writing Beyond Writing, is the assumption that because the Latin alphabet that we use is used for functional purposes, for conveying information, for storing information, for doing calculations, whatever. The assumption is that that's what writing is all about. That's what writing is for. When you look at scripts from a number of other cultures, you realize that if their first experience of writing is to carve a charm into buffalo horn, then you kind of go, oh, this is really interesting, because they are taking their own skills and abilities and intentions and combining them with the strength and the endurance of the buffalo. And the writing and the substrate, the material you're writing on or in, have that kind of conjoined power. Same again, when you have, people engraving runes into swords, and you're trying to bring together the power of intention and the power of thought with the power of physical materials. And you don't really understand writing, I've come to realize, if you think that writing is something that you simply superimpose on literally a blank canvas that has no meaning. The origins of writing in many places are taking the power of intention, the power of thought, and saying, how can I project that thought into the physical world? And when you think in those terms, you suddenly go, oh, that's what I do when I'm writing a book. I am trying to take the best of my thought and to project it out into the physical world in a way that it influences other people. And there you're really talking about writing in the sense that I was saying at the very beginning, which is the notion that writing itself is something that is endangered, or a certain way of thinking about writing is endangered when we start equating writing with computing or writing with AI, for example.
With that purely functional.
Exactly.
And
also purely industrial. I mean, one of the influences of printing was to think that writing should have certain industrial qualities. It should be transportable. It should be legible. It should be done at speed. It should be infinitely multiplicable, etc., etc. And before that, writing had some very, very different virtues, which we are in grave danger of forgetting.
And that brings me to a question. I totally see what you're saying, that sense of shifting writing from something personal and with a personal connection even to the person who wrote it, like you can identify who wrote something by their handwriting, right? To something that, like you say, should be easily reproducible at speed, reproducible at scale, and should be functionally each version of a thing should be identical. You shouldn't be able to tell the provenance of the thing just by looking at the letter form or something like that. And that brings me to a question that I'm thinking of as we're talking about this. And I want to just sort of throw it in there real quick before because I want to hear more about what you've got planned for World Endangered Writing Day. But I want to ask what you think about something, because when you talked about carving the symbols into the buffalo horn and sort of the runes into the sword and the thinking that goes into that brought a thought to mind. And we even use the expression occasionally in English still, because what are these? These are forms of some kind of essentially like almost sympathetic magic or something like that, right? And we will say still something in English about something being written in blood, right? And there's that. But
even more, we use the word spell, right?
True.
The word spell.
Good point. You're absolutely right. We use the word spell. We talk about things being written in blood. So we do have, sort of fossilized in some of our idioms, this idea of the medium and the substrate and all of this sort of, and the will, the intent of the writer combining for a particular purpose. Do you think that we are those places that use, for example, the Latin alphabet? Do you think we are moving away from that understanding and away from that in general? Because font designers and writers, poets, etc., are probably going to be in a different category. But in general, do you think we're moving away from that understanding of that connection between medium, substrate, and written word, and intent?
Oh, absolutely. And as I say, I spent my whole adult life as a writer, and it never occurred to me to think about what I was writing on and how that contributed to what I was doing, or how the shapes of the letters originated or affect the impact of what I'm writing. It's sort of fascinating how this entire area of thought is missing in intellectual adventure. There is no academic discipline devoted to this. So linguistics as a study of spoken language is extraordinarily sophisticated and fine-tuned to very, very sort of sharply focused approaches to it. And by comparison, the very fact that we're having this conversation and we're nodding as if we're discovering things and this is new is a sign that we're really early on in this. And the fact that, we need World Endangered Writing Day to start bringing these issues to people's attention, to intelligent, educated people's attention. There is this kind of black hole in the middle of a variety of disciplines of thought And so we're trying to go in there, to mix metaphors terribly. We're trying to shine a light into the black hole.
And hope it's not like a real black hole that's just
Yeah,
going to
right.
absorb the photons and not release
Yes.
them. Are you planning a series of entirely online events and talks? Are there going to be some virtual, or I'm sorry, some in person as well? What's sort of your vision? Like,
Right.
if you woke up the day after World Endangered Writing Day and everything had gone just swimmingly, what would that look like? How would things have rolled out?
So yes, I realize that we have to deal with a subject that to many people is entirely new. That I want to include people from all over the world. That I want to bring in people who have a variety of different interests, of a variety of different backgrounds and ages, etc. And of course, that's pretty much impossible. So most of what we're doing is a series of live streamed events which are going through the Endangered Alphabet's YouTube channel. And this is going to be a series of talks and discussions with people who come at these issues that you and I have been discussing from a variety of different points of view. So, for example, we do have a type designer coming as part of it. We do have someone talking about Kipu. We do have people asking the question, what is writing? So there's all of that, which is kind of like an online teach-in. We are very much hoping to have some IRL events as well. That's sort of still in the planning stage. But then we're also going to be bringing in some recorded video from around the world that will show people who are actually working on revitalizing their scripts in their own particular communities. Some of those are just wonderful. But then we're also going to have a bunch of stuff that is hosted on the endangeredalphabets.com website. And this is asynchronous, as they say. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to pay tribute to the people who are working on revitalizing their own script and their own culture all around the world. So we have a series of awards for different categories for people who are doing that. So that's going to be up on the website. I wanted to pay tribute to the people, mostly but not entirely, from the privileged West, who have been the digital pioneers, who've actually helped to start creating fonts in minority scripts, and then I'm incapable of not doing this. There are some fun elements on the website. There's a quiz. There's also, we're doing what I call the second wave launch of the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, which is at endangeredalphabets.net. So we are launching 100 more scripts on that, which are going to be so worth exploring that I've created a game. It's a puzzle game that people can only win by reading through the profiles of these scripts. Oh, wow. So there are all kinds of clues hidden throughout them, and they're going to be real prizes. I mean, prizes worth something in all of that. And so World Endangered Writing Day is also the launch of the second expanded Atlas of Endangered Alphabets. And it's also the publication day of my book, Writing Beyond Writing, which really tries to address all of these issues we've been talking about today.
That's absolutely fantastic. And I love that idea of having like that puzzle and people have to go in and read. And because that's such a wonderful resource, having that Atlas of endangered scripts. It's the closest analog I have in my mind, probably because my background is in linguistics, is something like Ethnologue, right? That does the same for languages, not just endangered ones, of course. But I feel like anybody who goes to look at the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets will immediately be struck by, you alluded to this earlier, what a what's the word that I'm looking for? What a gap that fills. in what has been out there heretofore, because there really hasn't been, there hasn't been this sense of a lot of academic study going into this issue, and not a sense of a lot of attention going to it. And whereas linguistics is an extremely well not just well developed, but like it's not just well developed, but it's spread out, right? We've got linguistic thought from various areas of the world. We have decades, centuries, really, of different kinds of linguistic theory. We've got grammars of all kinds of different languages. We've got this sense that linguistics is sort of the fulsome science that it is, study that it is, because we're able to draw on so many traditions and incorporate them into the larger study, And I think when we go to the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, we realize this is what we've been missing. This is one of the missing parts that we're now able to sort of look at and say, okay, here's something to round out our knowledge of what language is, how language works, how it spreads, and what it means in a certain way. I really feel, as somebody with a background in linguistics, but then being involved with your work, I really feel that studying scripts, endangered and non-endangered, but especially endangered ones, precisely because of the things that they teach us about what writing means and what writing can mean, it teaches us something about language itself, which then, because the study of language teaches us this, tells us something about who we are as a species. And I think that's absolutely invaluable.
Thanks so much.